Hello, my wonderful, beautiful friends, guys. Welcome back to r/MaliciousCompliance, where people follow orders to spite someone. And in this episode, OP obeys a rude Karen, and he ends up getting away with $10,000 for free, guys. I hope you enjoy the super satisfying stories. Don't shake your heads too hard, and as always, you can send or link your post to this email right here. Let's dive in. Backstory time. About a year ago, I was working seasonal at a gift store. My store sold things from a wide price range, from $10 pens to $750 clocks. Not to mention the main draw of our store was custom engraving, which cost even more. For the holidays, we had a buy one get one 75% off, which was huge. But the stipulation was that you'd get the discount on the cheapest items in your transaction. I was one of the people who worked the machines and not a sales/cashier worker. So here's the actual story. It was a slow day, so they had me practice on the register to get to know how to do it. So I'm ringing up my first customer, slowly since I know nothing about the register system. The woman had bought two fairly expensive gifts, both of which are final sale items, no returns or refunds, and both around $200 to $250 each, so she was getting the $200 item for $50, since it's the cheaper item. Now, as anyone who's worked in retail knows, you have to give a spiel about the reward systems, yada yada yada. As I start ringing her up, she asks for a $4 gift bag we sell as well. I say of course, and then add it to the register, and then notice that since the $4 bag was now the cheapest item, that she would get the 75% off on that, and the system returned the $200 item to the full price. I was about to mention this, and I say, "Now miss, I should tell you that." She then interrupts me and says, "Listen, I'm very busy, and no offense, but you've taken way longer than you should have. I don't want to hear about your rewards program. I have someplace to be soon." Now, I was taken back a bit, as up to this moment, she was pleasant. And I say to her, "No, I mean, if you just let me talk, She then interrupts me again and says, "Did you not hear what I just said? Just check me out already." I then say okay. So I ring her up, tell her the total, and she pays. She goes on her way, acting like I kept her waiting for hours when it was like 10 minutes. 10 minutes later, she's back in here yelling how we ripped her off, and that we didn't give her 75% off. The woman basically screams at me and says, "How come I was charged full price? This item," holding up the $200 item, "is the cheaper item. Why didn't you discount me on that?" I tell her, "Ma'am, it was the cheaper item until you bought the $4 bag. I was trying to tell you that, but you cut me off." She then screams and says, "Well, I demand a refund." I tell her, "I can't do that, ma'am. Unfortunately, you bought these items and they're final sale." She then demands my manager, who tells her pretty much the same thing. She was not happy. You know what, guys? On the bright side, at least she saved $3 on that gift bag. Like, it's the little wins, right? But yeah, I love it when Karens don't let others explain themselves, and in the end, they pay for it. Literally. And also, why did she not pay attention to the total when she was at the register? Was that Karen that rich that she just paid whatever the machine prompted her to pay without even looking at it? And this person shares their comment and says, "As a retail worker, this totally reminds me of customers asking me where things are, and literally walking away from me as I'm telling them where it is. This happens very often. Sometimes the location can be tricky, and I'm not able to fully explain where it is because I'm not gonna chase them, and I'm not gonna yell so they can hear me. Then, predictably, they'll come back saying they couldn't find it. I don't want to look like an incompetent worker who can't communicate. So if I feel ballsy, I'll defend myself by saying, I was trying to tell you where it is, but you walked away from me." So this happened in 2014. I had just lost my job and I was in the process of looking for a new one, but I didn't have much money saved to pay bills in the meantime. So I asked my father if I could borrow $1,200 just to get me through to the next month, and I would pay him back as soon as I start working again. He sent the money, I paid the bills, and I got a new job shortly after. As soon as I had the money to pay him back, I used my bank's online bill pay option to send him a check. I sent him a text message and told him it's on the way, and just assumed that was the end of it. Well, a week went by and he hadn't gotten it. I thought maybe it took a few days for the bank to process the bill pay option because I hadn't used it before. I then asked him to just wait a few more days and to see if it came. Several days later, it still hadn't gotten there, so I called the bank and asked them, and they told me I could stop the payment on it for free, so I did. Then I just wrote a personal check and then mailed it. I just assumed that something went wrong with the online bill pay. So about 2 months later, I got a check in the mail from a medical facility in the state my father lives in for $1,200. I called and asked them about it, and they told me on a recorded line that it was an overpayment on an account my father had with them, and it was a legitimate check and it was mine to keep. At that point, I didn't associate it with the bill pay thing that I tried to do a couple of months before. I called my father to ask about his accounts with his place because there was no reason they should have my address to be sending me an overpayment. He had no idea what was going on because he hadn't used that facility in a few years. So I look up the place on Google and it finally dawned on me what happened. My father's address was on Saddlewood Drive at that point in time. But when I typed it into the bill pay, my phone auto-corrects it to Sandalwood. And it just happened to be the same numerical address. And because my father's name was listed as the payee, they attempted to apply it to his account. So that's where my check had gone. I tried to contact them again and explain what happened, and the lady on the phone was extremely rude to me. She told me, "I've already talked to you about this. I don't know why you're calling again. We sent you what we owed you. This account is settled and I will not be talking about it again." Again, this is a recorded line, so I asked if she was sure they owed me this money. She practically shouted yes into the phone, and I just smiled and then hung up the phone. I then deposited the check into my bank that day. They didn't try to call me back until about 6 weeks later, and I was wondering how long it would take. The person who called me was a different lady, and she called me to tell me that a mistake had been made, and that I now owed them $1,200. I told her she was misinformed and that she should go back and listen to the calls I made to their office and gave her the dates. I told her I'd been reassured multiple times that the money was mine and that I was in the clear to cash that check. And then I hung up. I haven't heard a single thing about it since then. Yeah, I would love to see their faces when they go back and listen to the recording, guys. Like, I'm just so curious how it's gonna go after that. And I love this comment. This person says, 2 wrongs make 1,200 rights. And guys, if you think that mix-up was wild, listen to this one. This story's back from when I was attending university several years ago. I was the president of school club. We had good attendance but limited interest in leadership positions. That meant that I was the only acting officer of this club, making me the secretary and the treasurer also. The other officers were actually previous club presidents who had graduated. You just needed 3 student ID numbers to remain an active club. I had planned a huge ice cream social that went great. I rented a ballroom on campus, had ice cream catering, a live band, and almost 100 students in attendance. It was a great way to begin the school year. Anyways, it all cost something like $1,021.17. Now that's not the actual amount, but it's something like that. There were 2 methods to pay for this kind of thing. You would petition in advance for university funds or pay for it yourself and submit a reimbursement after the fact. In the past, the school had taken 6 months to pay a vendor I used, and it was a stressful experience because I wanted them to be paid. I felt terrible having to just keep saying the university's working on it, and going to the student finance office twice a week to ask them about it for months. So I figured I'd take the hit and wait for the funds myself. I could sweat it out on student loans and get the band and caterer paid in a timely fashion. There's also a bunch of compliance paperwork to fill out. You have to submit itemized receipts, etc., etc. Long story short, it's a process, but I got it all filed and I waited. About 4 months later, I got an email prompting me of an activity in the student finance portal to approve a direct deposit to my account. You have to confirm the amount. Now, I wish I'd been drinking water because I would have spat it out dramatically, but the amount was for $10,211.70. They had clearly misplaced the decimal point. I could accept or comment on it, so I wrote that the amount should have been $1,021.17. In 1 hour, I got the response back along the lines of, yes, the amount is 10211.70. So I responded to the email and said, no, it should be 1021.17. The response was that she couldn't find an issue. Now look, I'm terribly dyslexic. I actually am. So I was genuinely thinking that maybe I misread it and caused her to be confused. Maybe for who knows why, the computer put 3 numbers after the decimal, so I was reading 1021.170. And thinking I saw the 10,211.70 or something. I had a friend look at it and she confirmed that I was in fact reading it correctly. But hey, maybe the lady in finance office was also dyslexic, or she was overworked, or she could care less to actually look. Whatever the case, I can explain myself better in person. So I walked down to the office. I was a regular at this point. There was hardly ever a line because nearly everything's done online. So I go up to the desk and say there's been a mistake on the reimbursement request for a club event. I'm told to have a seat and she'll chat with me in a moment. So I wait for about half an hour while she sat on her phone at the desk. And then she calls me up. I then explain that I was over reimbursed and she says, "Look, as I've told you, there's nothing wrong," being quite snappy with me. So I say to her, "But it's off by a decimal place." The woman kind of just sighs and she says she could deny the reimbursement or I could accept it and leave and let her go on with her day. She seemed to be getting very upset with me, probably because I was constantly asking her about the payment. I said I would accept it and left. So when you accept, you can make a comment, so I basically typed in the comment box that I tried to remedy the situation and I was told there was no issue, repeatedly, over chat and in person, and also that I was threatened to not be reimbursed at all. I then took screenshots of all the messages in case I had to defend myself. After a few business days, the money was direct deposited into my bank account. I let it sit there for a couple of years while I was a student, expecting them to find an error and demand the money back. When I was getting close to graduating and that never happened, I gave the money to a member in my club whose parents stopped paying his tuition because he started testosterone. Interestingly enough, for any events over $15,000, you had to file invoices in advance and have it pre-approved. Anything under that, they recommend you do this, but you can be reimbursed with proper receipts and paperwork. I think that's why it didn't raise any alarms in the computer system. At least that's all I can reason. It kind of haunts me to this day that I might randomly owe $9,000 at some point, and I just don't understand what I was saying wrong that she couldn't understand me. And I do worry that I should have gone to her supervisor, but I was 19 years old, so I just did what I was told. Oh man, guys, 19 years old with essentially free $9,000. I don't know a lot of people who would have kept it for 2 years like OP did, so kudos to him for that. And honestly, universities are making so much money from tuition already, to the point, I guess, where they can afford to lose $9,000 over tiny mistakes. And if it makes OP feel any better, technically the money he gave to the other student is going back to the university. So it all works out. I was in middle school in the 90s. I loved growing up then, and even though there were gangs in my area, I generally avoided trouble. One of my classmates had this big field trip planned, and they had us selling chocolates to raise money for the trip. I was pretty good at it, and I was selling at a good rate. I would take the bus to school, and my stop was 2 blocks away from my home. I got off at my stop one day with my box of chocolates, and I saw this older kid who's around 16 to 17 years old. He's pretty big for his age, and he was hanging out there. He saw me and he came towards me. Now the guy is clearly a gangbanger. He comes up to me and says, "Hey homie, where you from?" He was asking what gang I was from. It wasn't the first time I got challenged like this, so I just reply, I don't bang man, I'm just a junior high kid. He then looks at my box of chocolates and he takes it from me. He says to me, "What's this?" I tell him it's nothing, it's something for school. He then opens the box and he sees a bunch of dollars in there. He then grabs the bills, around $15, which was my sales for the day. He also takes a bunch of chocolates as well. He then says to me, "Tomorrow, you're gonna give me $20 more. If you don't, we're gonna have a real effing problem." I walk away feeling scared and pissed off. I realize that I'm gonna have to pay back the lost money from my birthday money. And I definitely didn't want to give this guy any more money. I think about it, and I decide that I'll get off at a later bus stop from now on, and then walk a little bit more just to avoid this guy. The next day, this is what I do. I stuff my box in my backpack just in case, and I exit about 2 stops later. I don't see the guy, and I think I've solved my problem. And then I get to the liquor store a block away from my home, and who do I see but this overgrown idiot who we'll call Payaso. He says to me, "Hey man, you didn't forget about me, did you?" I say to him, "Look man, I don't have any money right now. I don't even have my chocolates. I left them at home." And I shouldn't have said that. He then says, "Okay, well, let's go to your house. And you're gonna give me the money or something else if you don't got it." I begin to get really nervous. My mom's at work and my grandma's home. I definitely don't want to bring him home with her there. I glance at him and notice the tattoos on his arms. At this point, I saw the perfect opportunity for malicious compliance. I tell him, "Well, I don't think that's a good idea. Why don't you just let me go, man?" Payaso grabs me by the collar and then he says to me, "I tell you what to do and you effing do it, understood?" I nod my head and tell him to follow me. Now it's time I give a little background. My neighbor that lived in the house next to mine was a veterano, a veteran of one of the biggest, most notorious gangs in the city. He was in his 40s, and he was a really chill dude. He loved my grandma because she would often share plates of food she made with him and his wife, and he was fond of me because I taught his 8-year-old boy how to play baseball. His son also had a disability, a problem with one of his legs, so most other kids wouldn't play with him, but I often did. So let's call my neighbor OG. OG always had a bunch of guys over at his house. He made sure they never caused problems, and they were all respectful towards my family in particular. So back to Payaso. The tattoos on his arms, I realized that he was from the same gang as OG. I have this big smile as I'm walking home, and Payaso just asked me, "Why are you smiling, idiot?" I say to him, "No reason," and keep walking home. As we get closer, I see a bunch of guys hanging out at OG's house. Payaso narrows his eyes, and then he smiles as he recognizes some of the guys. We get to OG's house, and Payaso says, "Wait here, let me talk to my homies." OG's sitting on his porch, and Payaso starts greeting some of the guys, and then heads towards OG. OG then notices me, and he says my name. He says to me, "Hey OP, what's up?" Payaso turns to look at me, and I say, "Payaso told me to wait here. I have to go home and give him money." Hearing that, OG stands up and says, "Why do you have to give him money?" I say, "Because he told me yesterday at my bus stop that the $15 and the chocolates he took from me wasn't enough, and I had to give him more today." Payaso begins to speak. He says, "You know this kid, OG?" OG then gives him the scariest look that I've ever seen and tells him to shut the F up. OG then looks back at me and asks, "Is this from the chocolates you're selling?" I tell him yes, and OG asks me how many chocolates I have left to sell. I say about 50. He tells me not to worry, Payaso's gonna pay me for the 50 I have left, plus 20 for the day before, and an extra 50 for my trouble. He tells me to keep whatever else I sell. He then tells me to go home, and Payaso will be back later with my money. About an hour later, there was a knock on my door, and Payaso has an envelope, and he says, "Here's $120, little homie. I effed up, and I'm really sorry. Do you have a Nintendo? I brought you some games." Now, I just stood there stunned and thinking how I never would have guessed that getting robbed had so many benefits. I didn't see Payaso too many times after that, but whenever I did, he would wave at me, and he never bothered me again. I just want to say that I love this post so much, guys. And the fact that Payaso just starts kissing OP's feet after finding out that one of the gang veterans is cool with OP, sometimes it really does pay to have friends in low places. Okay, so this happened over 20 years ago, when I was in my early 20s. I worked at a convenience store. Our store had a small room built on the outside where we placed cans and bottles into big bags to return to the companies who distributed beer or soda. Anyways, one day I was at the end of my shift. It was about 10 or 10:30 at night, and I believe it was my Friday, so I wouldn't be back in for at least 2 days. I was in the bottle room, sorting bottles I took on my shift, and then I hear, "Hey." I look up, and it's a regular we got in there. It was a 12-year-old kid. The kid says to me, "Hey Joe, could you buy me some beer for me and my friends?" I was surprised. I say to him, "What? No man, I'm not risking my job for that." The kid says, "Come on man, it'll be easy for you, and I'd owe you one." I told the kid no again, and I said I'm not risking my job, and I'm not risking the fine, which is up to $5,000. And also, I have no money. The kid then says, "Here, take this 20. He then holds up a $20 bill, and I say, "No man, I'm not gonna buy beer, dude." So this goes back and forth, and it goes on for like 5 to 10 minutes, and I'm getting irritated. I tell him no again. And again he says, "Come on, just take the money. I won't leave until you take the money." Cue my malicious compliance. I just look at the kid and then take the $20. The kid says, "Cool, I'll go wait behind the store. Don't say anything." I then leave and lock the door. I walk inside and look at my coworker. I tell him that this kid tried to get me to buy him beer, and when I told him no, he kept insisting that I take this $20. I told him I took it, and it's an annoyance tax. I told him to have a good night and then left. About a week or so later, the kid's in the store, and he's looking at candy. The guy waits until no one's there, and he comes up to the counter and he says, "Where's my effing money?" I just look at him and say, "What money?" He says to me, "My $20 for the beer you were supposed to buy." I then tell him, "I told you I wouldn't buy you beer, and after that, you kept insisting I take the $20 bill, and you wouldn't leave until I took it, remember?" He then gets all red in the face and says, "You'd better give me back my money or else." I then lean in towards him and say, "Or else what? Are you gonna call a cop and then tell the cop that I stole your $20 that you gave me to buy you and your friends beer?" At that, the kid looks surprised, and he walks out defeated. He never came back in when I was working. All I can say is I hope the kid learned his lesson that day. And OP's totally got him on that one, guys. There's nothing the kid can do, even if the cops were involved. But this person comments what they used to do as a teenager. And listen, I don't want to seem like I'm sharing tips on how to get beer as an underage person, but I thought this comment was quite good. This person comments, "As a teenager, we would just go into the store, grab a case of beer, and then walk out after throwing a 20 on the counter. We tipped, didn't offer to be carded, and no one ever chased us. Like, what's the guy gonna do? Call the cops and say someone paid for beer?" So this happened a couple of years ago, and I finally found the right subreddit to post this. I worked at a fast food restaurant, and we had a scanner machine to check if the money's real or not. One day, I touched the machine's sensor and noticed it still scanned my hand as money. I did this with paper as well and concluded the machine was broken. During the same shift, I had the one manager that often did nothing but sit on her ass all day and only help us with orders if we're behind orders by like 20 plus minutes. So I tell her about the machine, and she says she'll check it later. See, I'm supposed to scan a bill that's $10 or $20, and for 50 or hundreds, I have to give it to a manager to check. A few hours go by, and she still hasn't checked it. And by this point, I'm checking every bill that's $10 or $20 by holding it up to a light, which can be seen as rude to a customer. One customer complains to me, and she calls my manager over. The customer then complained how I was discriminating against her, and I shouldn't be checking a $10 bill like she's a frickin' criminal. Well, instead of defending me, saying the machine was broken and she hadn't checked it, she begins yelling at me in front of the customer. I told her the machine was broken and I needed to check each bill, and I would do the same thing if the machine was working. She then, without even checking the machine, just said to use the machine and said, "Who would even use a counterfeit on a $10 or $20 bill?" So I decided the argument wasn't worth $9 an hour, and I just complied. I quickly scanned every bill until I saw two shady-acting women. The first woman hands me a $20 bill that was obviously fake. I didn't even have to check it. It felt and looked like paper. I then decided that I would just follow orders and scan it. Since it went off, I put it in the register. The second customer came, and she hands me a similar counterfeit bill. I did the same thing. Later, when my shift was about to end, my manager counts my drawer and she finds the two counterfeit bills and she freaks out. I zoned out for most of it because most of it consisted of her calling me dumb for not noticing this obvious counterfeit and how I'm going to get fired. Well, what actually happened was the regional managers called me over to fire me before I told them the story. They then checked the cameras and listened to our conversation about the machine being broken, and then concluded that the manager was in the wrong for 1, not letting me check the bills, and 2, telling me to use the machine when I explained it was broken. She was then fired, and I saw her working the cash register at a grocery store. Hopefully she checks if she gets any counterfeit bills. Oh boy, that old manager really learned that karma is a bitch. And I can't believe she got the regional manager involved, only to have it backfire so hard on her. She deserves everything she got. And that, my friends, brings us to another end of r/MaliciousCompliance. Guys, I hope you enjoyed today's stories. If you did, hit that thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing so you don't miss these crazy stories. And if you missed yesterday's episode on the channel, it's an r/entitled People episode, where Karen lets her kids destroy OP's home. It's wild, go check it out if you haven't, and myself and Stevie Boy will see you guys in the next one. We love you.